I'm Peter Shacklock, and welcome to In Harmony with Nature. Our guest today is Dr. Walton Watt, and he's the head of freshwater fish habitat research with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans in Halifax. Welcome to the show, Dr. Watt.
Thank you very much.
I understand today we're going to be talking about liming of rivers and I guess trying to mitigate the effects of acid rain.
That's right. The impact of acid rain on Atlantic salmon has been rather dramatic, and the obvious sort of first idea that comes to mind is what can we do about it ourselves? And obviously we can't do much immediate right here in Nova Scotia to correct a continental, a global problem of atmospheric pollution. But you might be able to do something by treating the rivers. And that's what I've been exploring over the past few years, and I'd like to tell you what we've been able to discover.
Okay. How many years have you been doing this?
We've been liming for 9 years now. Various stages of the investigation. So we didn't rush into anything overnight. We got into it gradually.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And
would you be basing the talk tonight on slides, or are you?
Yes, I would like to. I'd like to show you slides of the operation. I've got a fairly complete collection of them. I think you'll be able to see the whole picture just on the basis of the slides we took.
Okay,
it's too bad we didn't have more in the way of videos or movies, but at the time I didn't realize it was going to have television potential.
Oh, I see. Yeah, 10 years ago or 9 years ago.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Our first slide shows what some people would say was a fairly straightforward approach. It's the technical fix to how to lime a river. The lime is being delivered from a pipe directly into the river, and it's a continuous feeding mechanism, and it comes from this silo which is set up on the banks of the river. Now, this has some particular problems associated with it if you use this technique. One is you have to have all-weather access to the site so that you can continuously pump more lime into your silo that's feeding the river, and you have to have electric power delivered reliably to the site. The problem for this type of approach to liming a river in Nova Scotia is that our acid rivers are along the Atlantic coast, and there are very few roads to the headwaters of those rivers because the inland from the Atlantic coast, that land is all used for forestry. And there's certainly, what forest roads there are tend to be very difficult to get past and to get through in the wintertime. So it didn't take too long to conclude that this was going to be prohibitively expensive because we'd have to build new roads to the headwaters and we'd have to put in new power lines. So we sort of costed it out, and we couldn't even get enough money lined up to do a test on this one. It was just so outrageously expensive in this proposition. So it's sort of sitting there as a possibility, but not a very viable one for Nova Scotia. Another approach that people think of when they talk about liming rivers is throwing limestone gravel into the river, which is what this is here. This has several problems associated with it too. They all have problems of one kind or another. This one has some virtually insurmountable problems, however. If you put the limestone in a slow-moving section of the river, it tends to get coated with chemical precipitate, which you see here, this brown material coating the white limestone. And this tends to remove it from chemical exchange with the water and becomes ineffective after a few months.
So it reacts with some of the metals in the water?
It's reacting with the acid and the metals in the water, and it forms a jelly-like substance on it, which then gets bacterial growth in it, and then it can develop algal growth as well. And it ceases to exchange with the water, and so it no longer neutralizes any of the water. If you put it in a section of the river that's faster so that it moves, it usually moves too much because a freshet will come along and it'll get all washed up into a gravel bank somewhere. This buries most of it under the gravel bank and removes it from contact with the water, and so it ceases to be effective again. This is what we're doing here is we're counting the numbers of juvenile salmon that were present above the limestone area, in the limestone gravel area, and downstream of it. Now, in this situation, we're looking at 2 sites above the limestone area. We found an average of about 8 juvenile salmon per 100 square meters. Right in the limestone area, we found about 50. So obviously it's working. But it only works in the immediate vicinity of the limestone gravel. When you go downstream about 1 kilometer, you're back to about 6 juvenile salmon per 100 square meters. The problem is that when they're in the vicinity of the gravel, the fish can go down actually into the gravel, and they seem to get some beneficial effects there. But it doesn't improve the downstream chemistry of the river at all, and obviously it doesn't have any impact on the downstream survival of the fish. So it seems to be quite impractical. The only way you can use this effectively is if you treat the entire river. Now, this is a model of what happens, how much limestone you actually need to get an increase in pH of half a unit, 0.5 pH unit on the scale on the left. And the different curves are different temperatures. The lowest curve is for 0 degrees, which would be the winter temperature in most of our rivers, or quite close to it. And that's on there because, of course, the low pH in the rivers occurs in the wintertime. In order to get an increase of half a degree in the wintertime in these rivers, we would have to have a dose that corresponds to about 200 tons of limestone per cubic meter second of flow in the river. And that is a big dose, and it looks like this. And the problem with that dose is there's no room left for the fish. In the summertime, there's just not enough water.
So that used to be a riverbed?
Yes, that is a riverbed.
Oh, really?
Okay, yes, this happens to be a stream that was treated in Ontario with limestone gravel, and that's about what it would look like. And it's totally impractical to treat the whole river this way, but we'd have to do that if we're going to achieve a substantial improvement with limestone gravel. It just becomes prohibitively expensive to... Well, another way of doing it is to treat the lakes. This seems a little bit more removed, but it's really fairly straightforward. The lakes flow out into the river, and if you neutralize the acid in the lakes, then the neutralized water will flow out into the rivers and will protect the downstream habitat. And we can lime the lakes from boats, as you're seeing going on here.
Is that a slurry of lime? Or
That's a slurry of lime being pumped into Sandy Lake down here at the near the mouth, near the D&D property in Sackville. And a slurry of lime pumped into the lake. We neutralized the lake, and subsequent to that, some of the salmon, which were in the lower part of the river, came right up the stream into the right up the stream at the outlet of Sandy Lake and spawned there. And that was the first time we've ever found salmon spawning in there in the past 20 years.
Really?
So it actually works, and fish are attracted into it. And you can put lime in lakes from helicopters.
That would be powder, would it?
Powdered. Oh, it's all powdered going into it's all powdered going into these lakes. That's a good point. We finely ground powder so that it dissolves fast in the water. Otherwise, if we just put limestone gravel in again, it's going to sink to the bottom, fall, and settle into the mud, and it's going to stay there. It wouldn't be useful at all. This is a fertilizer spreading plane, spreading lime over a lake in Halifax County.
Yeah, the first shots you showed of the lake or the river with the lime being pumped in.
Yes.
Was that a slurry again, or was that powder?
Yes, that is a dry powder going in. Yeah. But actually, silos in Sweden, they found that it works better if they slurry it first.
Okay, so it's partly dissolved.
Or just suspended in water so that it mixes better with the water and it spreads out more in the stream as it goes in. Okay. But that was just a dry powder falling into the river, and they had put a plastic sleeve on it to prevent it from blowing around too much. Because,
it was hard to tell the first slide. So you've shown the lumps and you've shown the
that's
slurry,
right.
So
I'm glad you picked me up on that. When you lime a lake, the pH goes way up very quickly, and then it starts to fall again. Now, Nova Scotia is a very humid area. We get about 1.5 meters of rainfall every year, and this means, since we have a lot of little lakes, that they tend to flush very quickly. And in fact, the average time that a drop of water spends in a lake in Nova Scotia is only about 6 months. So they flush, on average, twice a year. And this is one of our experimental lakes that we were looking at in the early 80s, Eastern Lakes out near Peggy's. And the dashed line is the theoretical curve given the flushing rate. And we found that where these little peaks come in above the dash line, that this is what happens when the lake mixes, which occurs in a lake every spring and every fall. The lake, the water turns over and it mixes. And some of the limestone, when we initially put it in, settles to the bottom of the lake. And it dissolves there. And when the lake mixes again, it comes back up into the lake from the depths. And this is what was coming back up again, these peaks. So the entire effect of liming the lake is sustained for a period of a little over a year, even though the mean residence time of water in the lake is only 6 months. So it is possible, if you get enough lime into the system, to bring it up to the point where it lasts for a year. But that's a major problem with this approach to liming. You have to repeat it every year.
Yeah, that's a continual problem.
There are always problems.
Yeah.
There is another problem here too, and that is with winter rainstorms, which are a commonly detested phenomenon here in Nova Scotia. Winter rainstorms can come in at a very low pH. You know, they on average they're higher in pH than summer rain, but it's still pretty low in pH. Now the problem is not too severe unless you're dealing with a situation where the fish in the outlet from the lake are accustomed to a high pH from your limed water. If you have them at a high pH from limed water and a winter rainstorm falls, it forms an acid layer just under the ice, right on top of the lake. And as you can see here, the curve on the right here shows the pH, and there's about a meter thick on top of that lake, just under the ice, that's lethal. And below that, it's not lethal because it was limed.
Of course, the surface water is what?
The surface water is what's flowing down the river. Fish can tolerate an increase in pH, a rapid rise in pH, because that's tending to make conditions better. But they cannot tolerate a rapid fall in pH. That tends to be quite lethal. So this is totally unacceptable. What we did to get around this is we started liming on the ice in the wintertime, spread it on the ice with a tractor. It's our initial setup in 1983, 84. And this works because when the rain falls, the first thing that happens is it washes some of the lime off the ice into the lake, and it tends to keep the pH up in the downstream portion of it. It tends to protect those fish. So at this point, we started looking at costs. How much is it going to cost to restore our acidified rivers by putting limestone in? And we're comparing it to the currently existing costs. And this is per returning fish. It's actually per angled fish or per caught fish. There was a commercial fishery also at this time. But it's per caught fish. And if we use existing hatchery capacity, it costs about $100 per caught fish. That's not too bad. It's sort of since the economists tell us that if a fish is angled, it's worth $200 or $300 to the local economy because of various spin-off effects. If it's caught in a commercial fishery, it's worth an average about $50, I suppose. It's just worth its per pound of meat cost. If we had to build new hatcheries, the costs would double. But we do have existing hatchery capacity, and that is currently the preferred method of mitigation in most of our rivers. We're using existing hatchery capacity to produce smolts, which are stocked into those rivers, to try and maintain a level of production that's, well, it doesn't quite compensate, but it does partially compensate for some of them.
Well, this might be another topic, but are they trying to breed in fish that can withstand the lower pH values?
No. It doesn't seem to be feasible on a short term to do that. The Atlantic salmon population doesn't seem to have acid-resistant strains. We've looked for those. So far we haven't found them. In trout you can find them, but not in the Atlantic salmon for some strange reason, where it doesn't... I think the trout is much more isolated in individual lakes and streams, whereas the salmon, the populations are a bit more mixed. It has genetic uniqueness, but it's not as unique as the trout. Well, liming with headwater, using the headwater lake technique, is about $200 a fish. And we could only do about 70% of the acidified habitat that way. We'd have to use streamside silos for the rest of it. That would cost about $500 a fish. The result gets kind of prohibitively expensive if you want to restore all of the habitat. So at this point, we decided that if we're just looking at trying to maintain a fishery, you're better off with using existing hatchery capacity, which is a proven technology, than to going into liming with all of its side effects and potential problems. Well, there is one other aspect of this that has to be taken into account, though, and that is the black area here. The black areas are areas where the salmon runs are now extinct. And each river is thought to have a genetically unique salmon population. Certainly, we do know that it's extremely difficult to restore salmon populations to barren habitat. And the probability of success is greater if you have a salmon population that's local, that's come from a next-door river. You're much more likely to be able to restore a river if you have local populations. And at this point, in 1986, we were looking at a situation where several of our rivers were showing a decline in pH. And we thought, well, we're likely to lose a lot more populations. We'd better look at trying to protect these runs somehow, trying to protect what we have left of populations that are on the verge of extinction. And one approach was, well, we could lime the river using the headwater lake approach to create a refuge that would keep a wild population going. So we decided to try to test the feasibility of that. And the river we chose for it was East River Chester, which at that time, the red curve here indicates the declining pH trend. It's quite noisy, but statistical analysis indicates that this is a significant drop. This is up to 1986. After 1986, interestingly enough, things leveled out in the rivers in Nova Scotia, and there is now no detectable trend. But at this point, we were really worried. The angling picture in East River shows a drop to no fish after about 1972. However, when we actually looked, when biologists looked in the river, they found one tributary that had a very small population of Atlantic salmon juveniles left in it. So we decided to lime that tributary. 4 of the headwater lakes in that tributary were limed. We're talking about spreading about 400 tons of limestone each year. We're going to spread it in the wintertime. We use a front-end loader. We bring it in by the dump truck, 25 dump truck loads each winter over an icy road, which has to be plowed and sanded just about each day. And the front-end loader dumps the limestone into hoppers, and these hoppers are driven out over the ice with these little 4-wheel drive all-terrain cycles. The gear is kept as light as possible to minimize danger to the people who are actually liming from. We've had limestone hoppers go through the ice, but we've never lost an all-terrain cycle or a driver.
Good. Yeah.
And a journalist who came out and looked at what we were doing out there said he thought we looked like demented farmers. Spreading our lime over these ice-covered fields.
It is the same lime that you put on, it's land lime.
It's agricultural land lime.
Yeah.
It's a slightly different version to what's normally used for agricultural activity. I go for a very low magnesium limestone, so it's called calcite limestone.
That's
but
available.
Other than that, it's the same.
It's available in Nova Scotia?
Oh, yes.
Okay, so we don't have trucking charges from out of the province?
No, their trucking charges in Nova Scotia are bad enough.
Yeah, okay.
All right. Now, with the liming program, we have a chemical sampling program. And this is one of our technicians collecting a water sample in the East River. And the chemistry of East River. Now, this might be a little difficult. All right. The upper curve shows the chemistry of the tributary where we started liming, and we started liming just about at the point where the pH was at a minimum in the middle of that graph. This is the upper curve, and then it starts up very steeply as we limed the tributary, brought the pH up, and created dramatically different chemical conditions for the fish in there. The bottom curve shows the river at the mouth, well below the confluence with the tributary. And that has become much noisier because it's being influenced by the line from the refuge, but only in the summertime. And in the wintertime, pHs are dropping back down to their normal lows. So it would probably be quite difficult for fish down there, but there were no fish down there at any rate to begin with because it was too toxic for them.
I see.
Okay, now this shows profiles. The bottom curve is the river before we started liming. High pHs were running about 5 in the tributary. Then the year after liming.
You have focus? Let's try that. Let's just see if it works.
Yes, quite right.
Okay.
How's that?
Okay.
Is that better?
That's good. Yeah.
Okay. The middle one is 1 year after we started liming, and the top one is 5 years after we started liming. We brought the pH up to approximately neutrality. All right, and we were watching the fish as well. And what happened to the fish? Let's see. Is that in focus?
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, it was just the lines were a little fuzzy.
I think the blue slides need a little bit of focusing.
Yeah.
We examined the fish by using a technique called electrofishing. The gentleman in the upstream here with this white probe, it's actually an electrode, and it puts an electric field in the water, and the fish are attracted to an electric field, and they swim right up into it, and you can then dip them out with a net, and we collect them in nets and put them in a bucket, and then we count them, and we measure them, and we put them back in the stream.
Yeah, so electrofishing is not electric shock. It's
Well,
electro-attracting?
Yes, it's a high voltage, like an electric fence, but fish tend to be anesthetized by it, and they're attracted to it as well. So they swim right into it, and they become anesthetized, and you can just dip them out, and then they recover in a few minutes in the bucket.
I had visions of this charge going through the water, but
it is a charge in the water, and that's why everybody there was wearing rubber gloves and rubber boots, because otherwise they would be, it's just like feeling an electric fence.
Yeah.
Now, we get this one in focus. This is what happened to the salmon population, juveniles in the river after we started liming. The liming started, okay, 1, 2, 3, about the 5th point along there, where you see this sudden jump in salmon, and then it's steady for a few years, and then suddenly it really takes off. That's when the first adult returns came back, where juveniles had been in the river when we started liming. They went to sea, and then they came back, and then there was a sudden dramatic increase in the number of juveniles in the river.
What year was the last point?
The last point on there is 1989.
It's still increasing in 1990?
Yes, it went up again in 1990, and I expect it to go up again next year.
Very good.
Not necessarily at this station, but what's happening now is there was a lot of empty habitat in that tributary, and the fish are spreading out into this empty habitat so that they're colonizing the entire tributary. It's quite impressive, and it was quite gratifying in a way, but still a very small project, because the entire tributary doesn't have the potential, even at full production, to produce more than about 200 salmon. So it's no great restoration project. It's still a relatively small research project. It's a it's a feasibility test. It's a small refuge that we've tried to create, and it does work. This is all right. This is basically the future that you see here. What's happened now is that Canada has negotiated. Is in the business of negotiating an international agreement. We have the Clean Air Act in the United States, which says that emissions are going to be reduced dramatically by the year 2000. We have federal-provincial agreement here in Canada, which says that Canadian emissions are going to be reduced to about half before the year 2000. And so this is only 10 years away. So there should be an improvement. At least things should not get worse. So there is now less of an emergency in terms of protecting the stocks that are threatened by acidification, and more one of concentrating on, well, we're going to have to measure what impact these control measures are having on our rivers. In other words, we have to monitor the rivers to see if they're going to improve as a result of the changes in emissions. And that's what that slide is. Those are cages in the river. We put them in the worst time of year, which is in November and December, after the fall decline in pH, when the river becomes quite acidic, but before it freezes up, because it's kind of hard to work in a frozen river.
Yeah.
And there are about 50 salmon juveniles in each of these cages, and they're put in the river, and in some of the acid rivers, when we put them in, they die. If you put them into Clyde River, Roseway River, Tuscot River, Jordan River, they're dead within a week. If you put them in slightly higher pH rivers, they can last as long as maybe at Keenan River, for instance, which is a branch of the East River where we're liming, they might last as long as 40 days. And in the limed rivers, there's no mortality at all. And if you put them in a high pH river, there's no mortality at all. By keeping track of these from year to year and how long the fish can survive, if conditions do improve, then we're going to be able to detect an improvement. They're going to survive longer and longer. And then eventually, some of the rivers where they couldn't survive now, they will be able to survive, and we'll know then that they're ripe for trying to reestablish a salmon population. And I'm a little bit more optimistic now than I was. Of course, when I was asked to give my opinion on it 10 years ago, I said 20 years. Now it's 10 years, which is perhaps not too bad.
Mainly because the emissions have been reduced?
Because of the emission control, the plans for emission control. We can say that we don't think things are going to get worse, and we think they should get at least a little bit better. Now, we're not sure how good they're going to get in Nova Scotia as a result of this continental emission control, because the controls, it depends upon where they cut the emissions. There's a national objective in the United States, and unless they cut emissions that are coming to Canada, it might have not as much effect here as we think. They could cut emissions that are having their maximum effect in the United States, not in
just
Canada.
Talking about cutting, we do have to cut. The time has come. I certainly enjoyed this talk, Dr. Watt. Our guest today has been Dr. Walton Watt of the Fish Habitat Research of the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. Good evening.